All right. So let's give you a bit of background. I've known producer Wes, who's done various YouTube shows, and he learned that I was just starting my channel, and he's very encouraging and wanted to help me. And they were having a discussion on whether or not Jesus existed and invited me on. And I said, sure. And I was on with other guests such as Godless Engineer and David Fitzgerald and Oz, which Oz, I've heard of him, but I've never even seen him before. So I was eager to do that. And looks like Apostasy and Michael Weisman is the host. And one more, where is he? Well, where did he go? Jordan from, I don't know why they don't have him listed. Oh, there it is, Reason to Doubt, but they don't have his name. So Jordan from Reason to Doubt. And there was no format. It was just kind of an open discussion. And I will tell you, before it occurred, I was a bit worried. I have been in touch with David Fitzgerald off and on since the Price-Ehrman debate. And that's where I first heard him. And I read his books and friended him, and I tagged him when I posted, when I was reading more books more actively. Now I mostly read on my phone. I would take pictures, screenshots, pictures of particular things and post them. And so I would tag him in the album I put him in. And I remember he got in a discussion with one of my friends who was a Christian and isn't very knowledgeable of the arguments and doesn't seem to listen. But anyway, so David Fitzgerald is very passionate about this topic, and he's very helpful. I was in a conversation with a scholar a couple of months ago, and I contacted David and I said, do you want to talk to this guy? And he's like, no, but if you need help, I have plenty of ammo to give you. And so, he's very helpful. He's a very nice guy, but he's also very passionate. And that passion often comes through as not being able to keep him. He's always wanted to get a word in, always wanted to get a word in. And, that's not a bad thing. But in a discussion like this, I think one needs to control yourself. I could have talked for an hour myself, but I didn't. So we will just see how it goes. So this is my commentary, and hopefully it will spark back things I was thinking of as I was listening to them. I'll put it at 1.5, and I might just jump around. All right. So this is the intro.
Wednesday, Secular Soapbox Day here at the Skeptic
Don't know that we need to
Haven Network. Today's topic is mythicism.
hear much of this. Okay, intros.
Doubt whether there was a Jesus or not. And if I'd heard somebody like me saying what I've been saying for the last 20 plus years, I would have thought it was ridiculous, because there's nothing implausible about Jesus being a guy. And it's not like we'll stop being atheists if it turned out there was just a dude named Jesus, because every atheist I know says, oh, I know there wasn't, he wasn't the son of God, but of course there was a guy named Jesus, just like I did, for 16 years when I was an atheist. But the thing is, for me anyway, what happened was when I read the Gospels and you don't think the guy existed at all. And no hyperbole. I don't think he existed at all. And I think early Christianity and the New Testament would look.
One thing I would have liked to have done and had maybe I should have suggested it before the show is to just go through each person's position, and history is about probability. So, assign a probability to a man existing that inspired a movement such as this. And I'm probably about 20% that he actually existed. because I don't think David is saying, 100% he didn't exist, but I still would have liked to have signed those probabilities. And I also did not know Jordan, who is an atheist, but he is also a historicist. I did not know that. I thought we were all going to be mythicists. And so I kind of felt like Jordan was going to be picked on once I learned that. And that's another reason I kept my mouth shut. But I would just like to know what percentage he would give to Jesus not existing.
Look very differently, even if he was just a guy, just a dude.
Interesting. For sure. Yeah, they definitely got a couple different Jesuses in there. Jesus is die. Jesus is
Jesus.
all those Jesus in there. They're all different. So what about all the historical evidence though? I mean, you got what is it, the foreskin of Jesus, and you got the shroud of Turin. All these real things. Jesus was real. What do you say about all that?
Right. Seriously, I had a Christian on Facebook trying to. That was his checkmate atheist moment. Well, the shroud of Turin. It's like, dude, are you kidding?
You were talking to
It's
Otangelo?
We're not.
Oh boy, Otangelo. Oh, if you don't know him, well, he I actually kind of worry about him, because when I actually hear him talk, and the fact that so many things go over his head, I almost think there might be something messed up in his thinking processes, and I don't know if he might have a condition or what, but he does think the Shroud of Turin is a real thing, and you can take it from there. And if you ever debate him on intelligent design, he will send you just a gish gallop of pages and pages of stuff that he has pre-formatted, and it's anyway. He does make an appearance.
Yes,
Was it?
chat.
Oh my God, that's
It
awesome.
was. That's who it was. Yes. Yeah.
That guy gets around.
He acted like that was
All right, don't need that.
But
boom. Yeah.
But Jesus. I mean,
Absolutely.
But Jesus.
But Jesus. But reason.
so typically the evidence that people
Or the
go
other one
to.
who kills me.
Oh, so go ahead, David.
No.
We'll get it.
You've got Zoom syndrome.
Find out listening.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, typically the evidence that is appealed to, as far as like people looking to establish a historical version of Jesus, it's not going to be physical evidence or anything like that, because Jesus didn't leave any physical evidence, as far as we know. So we don't really expect to find things that that just simply aren't there. Like that's not the thing, that the linchpin in all of it. What we end up having to do is look at what was written about him, and what exactly people were believing about him, and what were the earliest sources saying about him. And I think that's where we kind of get into.
Yeah. And who were these earliest sources?
Yeah.
And how reliable are those early sources? Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a mistake some people make is they argue from the lack of physical evidence. But I mean, the simple fact is we don't have physical evidence for the vast and overwhelming majority of people who existed. Mm-hmm. And so that in itself isn't persuasive.
But here's the thing, is like whenever they compare, if you throw out Jesus, you have to throw out everybody in ancient history. It's like, no, we just have to temper our.
Don't care about that.
Alexander the Great was a real person, and why we're doubting whether or not Jesus was. Alexander the Great had eyewitnesses as well. That's mentioned by Arian, and so we know that Alexander the Great was a real person, despite the best biography written about Alexander the Great being written 400 years later, and that's because Arian at the time.
Don't
these
care
things.
about that.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas for most of the things that you use to prop up somebody's historical claims, for most of those categories, Jesus has no evidence whatsoever. And the one that he does, textual evidence, is by false attributed eyewitnesses who are non-eyewitnesses after the fact, telling a story because they want to sell you a religion, explicitly saying that. It's like, that's not the best kind of textual evidence. That's the worst kind of textual evidence.
So what you're saying is the gospel is not historical evidence for Jesus.
Which gospel? There's so many of them,
Well, I think it's a mistake to throw out the Gospels carte blanche as having any sort of historical value. Certainly, we can't just read them and accept what it says without any kind of scrutiny, because if we did that, we'd all be Christians. So obviously, they're problematic. But if not,
so I'm not sure. I don't recall. I was kind of tired. I don't know if anybody pointed it out that, how do we evaluate the Gospels when they're anonymous? I don't, a lot of people say they were written late, but that's not really an issue. More the issue is that they do not say who or what their sources are. They don't say, I went to the records of that Pilate kept, and yes, he crucified this man, and he disappeared from his tomb. And that's how I know that he disappeared from his tomb. And he doesn't say that. They don't say that. We had these documents from Peter that talks about how he walked with Jesus. So I don't think anybody ever pointed out that the Gospels were anonymous. They may have, I may have missed it, but that does need to be pointed out in any argument saying we can use the Gospels as having some degree of historical reliability as to the account of this man that walked around and inspired a movement.
Nothing else. If they are nothing else, they're books that were written by people who believed about things that they believed about in a point in history. And
Yes.
so that's
Well,
why
wait,
there's.
let me stop you for a second there, because we'll say more
David?
about that. But
Well, I was just saying. So
because I don't know.
it may not be the case. I don't think a priori you can just kind of throw them out because they were written by believers. You just have to take that into account when you're evaluating whether they can be trusted on something I say.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's what David was saying about the Gospels. I mean, the Gospels have been proven to be, historically unreliable, and that's where I'm regularly
Right.
confused because scholars like Bart Ehrman, who is propped up by people a lot, he's very confusing because he seems to talk out of both of the sides of his mouth. Because on the one hand, he considers them the Gospels to be historically unreliable, but on the other hand, they're historically reliable enough to tell us even some of the smallest details about Jesus.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's
funny
kind of
you say
confusing.
that. Yeah, he wrote a book of debate. They did a transcript of one of his debates not too long ago on can we trust the New Testament on the historical Jesus, and it could have been me talking up there because he and I were in lockstep agreement about no, we can't trust the Gospels about Jesus, and there's many reasons for that. It's not just that we don't throw them out a priori. We throw them out because they all seem to be based on the first Gospel, Mark. And Mark's Gospel seems to be allegorical from start to finish. Those are just some of the reasons. I mean, the historical accounts.
I will say it later, but read The Power of Parable by John Dominic Crossan. It is an amazing book, even though he's not a mythicist, that can really aid people in making this argument. Sorry, I got distracted by my stupid phone. What did David
Of say
say?
Jesus' trial and execution make no sense whatsoever, historically, logically, even from a story plot standpoint. But they make perfect sense as an allegory, and we find that throughout the gospel.
And if I can add, I'll let Jordan go here in a second because I know he's itching to get in on this. But I do want to add that there's substantial, strong evidence that suggests that whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark actually had Paul's epistles, and so he was using Paul's epistles to generate his gospel. So, I mean, honestly, the Gospel of Mark isn't even like an independent account.
I haven't read it, but if you're interested, there's a book by Tom Dykstra that does promote this claim. So there you are. It's Dykstra, Tom Dykstra.
Or an independently written thing. It was definitely dependent upon, like, at least Paul.
Okay.
Have a lot of legendary development to them, and so we have to be very careful about accepting one thing or another. But while I don't think we can say things like the transcript that we get of Jesus's conversation with Pontius Pilate, like how would anybody have known that? Anybody who was there and still living to give their testimony wouldn't have been likely to talk to a Christian.
So I don't know why Jordan necessarily says legendary development. Why couldn't it all have been created by Mark and people, Matthew and Luke, especially with the infancy narratives? Why couldn't they have just added to the story? It was a story, and they just embellished a story. And so I don't know why he's talking about legendary. I don't know what he means by legendary development.
Right. So I don't think we can. There's good reason to doubt that the Gospels are giving us accurate information when it comes to that. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a crucifixion. It just means that we can't trust Mark when it comes to like what happened during the crucifixion, if that makes sense. So I mean, if you get down to the base level of the claim being made, which is that Jesus was a religious prophet who preached a message of apocalypticism and faced the fate of most apocalyptic prophets of his time, being crucified, I mean, it doesn't seem like a big claim.
Who makes that claim though in original Christianity? People like Jordan, historicist, are making that claim now, but who made that claim then?
It doesn't seem like a big claim, but at the same time, I don't think that there's good criteria that's been put forth that would allow us to sift through like gospel information in order to get that kind of information. I've read the arguments from like Ehrman, who is you know, one of the ones that, you know, does this a lot. He's regularly appealed to, but you know, the like for instance, one of the things that is supposedly known about Jesus is that he's from Nazareth, and the reasoning that Bart Ehrman gives is, oh, who would make that up about somebody because it was a hillbilly hick town? But you know, when you actually look at the historical evidence surrounding Nazareth and the attitudes towards Nazareth at that time and everything like that, it's kind of hard to actually support that argument. For one, like Nazareth was not like hillbilly hick town that just nobody cared about or whatever at the time. That seems to not be true. But also, there's the prevalence of savior figures, just like Jesus, coming from you know, small rural towns or whatnot. So it doesn't seem really out of the norm for, you know, to make up a figure to come from some, you know, small or no name town. But so I mean, there's a lot of problems with just assuming that Nazareth is the location. Plus, you end up having to ignore the fact that the Gospels themselves tell us that the reason why he's from Nazareth is because the Scriptures say that he's supposed to be from Nazareth.
Bingo.
Well, Matthew says
Bingo. And there's other scriptures for. Yeah, there's Mark had his scriptures that made it from Nazareth. Matthew had his scriptures that made it from Bethlehem. Other people could have been from Cana. There were all kinds of different exegesis they could point to say, oh no, the Messiah is going to come from this place here.
Well, Matthew and Luke go to great lengths to get him to be born in Bethlehem in some sense of the word. So it's clear that for those two writers, it was very important that he would be born from Bethlehem. So why then, like, the dichotomy?
But I want to stop you there because, well, here's the thing. Like Hitchens made the same argument. Says the bullshit, the obvious forgery of it is telling that he must have really been born in Nazareth because they really, really wanted him to be born in Bethlehem. But all it means is that those guys knew that they had a scripture that said he has to be born in Bethlehem. Mark had scripture that said he had to be born in Nazareth. And it's really that.
So could you tell me, maybe you don't remember off the top of your head, and that's fine. Where is it, like what prophecy is Mark? The only prophecy I'm aware of is the one that Matthew appeals to that we no longer have. He appeals to some prophecy that doesn't exist. Or maybe it exists for him, doesn't exist in our sources.
And that is exactly true.
What about Mark? So I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, I'm not talking about prophecy per se, but he chose Nazareth because Netzer, he wanted Jesus to be a Nazarene, and not a Nazarite, not a from Nazareth. If you read in my book, Jesus, Mything in Action and Nailed, we talk about how for Mark never actually calls him Jesus of Nazareth. He uses it as a sect title, Jesus the Nazarene, which means something very different from somebody from Nazareth.
Okay, so how do we get from there to Matthew? Because Matthew definitely used Mark as the source. So
right, yeah, Matthew did, Luke did. What I'm saying is Mark actually doesn't say that Jesus is from Nazareth.
Okay, so Mark attributed him as part of this sect of Nazarenes because he had a reason for that, and Matthew misunderstood and said that he's from Nazareth because of that.
Well, see, I don't even know if he misunderstood.
So, as David said, it's Jesus the Nazarene, and when Matthew adapted Mark's material, and this may have been what Mark meant, but who knows? So Matthew 2:23 says that he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So it was fulfilled what was said through the prophets that he would be called a Nazarene. And it is speculated that Matthew is associating the word Nazarene with the Hebrew word netzer, branch or sprout. It was a common term for the Messiah, such as in Isaiah 11:1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesus. From his roots, a branch, netzer, will bear fruit. So since Hebrew was written only in consonants, it would have appeared as NZR, at least, phonetically, and the same main consonants as Nazareth. And in Aramaic, the common language of Jesus's day, the word Nazareth and the Hebrew word branch sounded very much alike. So, I mean, this is just, we would love to have explanations for everything, but often when it comes to religious ideas, you can't always explain them. And they may not make sense to us, but what was important, they made sense to them. So even if all we had was Jesus the Nazarene, and we go, well, what the heck does that mean? It's important to find that out if we can, but sometimes it's just religious jargon. That's the way they talk to each other, and they understand it. As Mark says, we don't want outsiders to understand it. So why was Mark going to clarify?
understood or if he just didn't care. That was important. I mean, the birth of Jesus doesn't happen in Mark's gospel at all. There's no nativity, and later gospel writers like Matthew and Luke, they didn't like that. They wanted to have more information. None of them were setting out to write the gospel according to me or the gospel according to this other guy. All of them were setting out to write the one true gospel. And Luke even makes that explicitly clear. He says there's so many people writing gospels right now. It seemed to me a good idea to investigate the story and see what really happened according to the traditions handed down to our generation. And then he takes Matthew and Mark's story and basically uses it as the framework for
I've always thought that was kind of amusing that Luke's almost like throwing shade on Mark, you know.
Totally. Honestly, we're lucky we still have the Gospel of Mark.
Just point out that Luke using Matthew and Mark is a minority position. Not that I have an issue with minority positions, but and I'm sure David doesn't really mean it. I'm sure it could be justified, but it's not a well-accepted view in scholarship. So it's possible Luke used Matthew, or it might be possible Matthew used Luke. I don't know. But
because both Matthew and Luke were writing to supplant it. John doesn't even really bother using it except for the basic storyline, and he doesn't have any problem switching things around and having Jesus crucified for completely different reasons in the Synoptic Gospels. And then there's Gospels like the Gospel of Peter, which we think is completely ridiculous because it has like a 500-foot tall Jesus coming out of the tomb and a talking cross. And yet, in its time, that Gospel was so much more popular than Mark's. We have 3 times as many copies of that Gospel as we do of the Gospel of Mark, and we're lucky to have it. Because again, these guys were writing to supplant.
I'd go with the cooler gospel too. Why not?
And I would
You got it.
like
I mean,
to attack it from, I guess, because you guys are much smarter than I am, so I have to take a more simple route to this information. and that is, I was like this. So if the gospel, any accounts of the gospels are true or accurate, what are they, and why? Why are they dependable? Why can we depend on these accounts to solidify this Jesus claim? And I always tell people I follow the evidence or the lack of good evidence for Yahweh the same way I do Jesus. I'm looking for good evidence that will support the claim. So show me the account, and then also show me why this is trustworthy. And then they have to do all the talking.
Well,
right.
I mean,
right. And I want to make it super clear. There's nothing implausible about Jesus being a real dude.
Absolutely.
Nothing at all. It's just when we look at the evidence, we don't have good evidence for that. We have good evidence that the earliest Christians, before Mark wrote his gospel and all the other gospels that were based on it, they looked at Jesus a completely different way than Christians did after the gospels were written. And it was a celestial Messiah, like the book of Hebrews. He does everything up in the heavenly realm, and nothing's happening on earth. But anyway, Jordan,
I was just going to say, I think historians would say that they've done that. You may not find what they've done compelling. But even if you throw out the Gospels entirely, you've got some indications of a physical Jesus in the writings of Paul and his references to James' brother, which I know Godless Engineer disagrees with me on, but that, and then also Josephus for the same reason. So we can get into. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I don't know if I'm the only person who thinks Jesus is actually real here.
Well, actually, maybe we should put it. What are the things you find most compelling about the historicist argument? Because, and this is the other thing I want to say is, like, it doesn't matter to us at the end of the day whether he was or wasn't. Because for me, all the back and forth between the mythicist side and the historicist side, just if at the end of the day, it shows us how little we can depend on anything, Christian right or wrong, whether Jesus is real or not. Our evidence for him is incredibly dodgy. And so I'm curious to know what are things you find most compelling about the historicist argument.
That's a good question. When I first was asked to look into this, I was talking to a Christian friend of mine about the reasons why I didn't believe in God, and he asked me what research I'd done into Jesus, and I had to admit, not much. So the first book I read was Carrier's book, and found it very persuasive and erudite. But then, as I try to be a good skeptic, and so I asked, like, well, why aren't the rest of historians persuaded by this? And so I looked into it, and the things that persuaded me most to come down against Carrier's position and position mythicists in general, I think the single strongest piece would be Josephus and Paul together referencing Jesus' brother, because if he didn't have a brother, if he had a brother, he has to be real, right? Then the combination, the historical plausibility of it, the fact that it is a small claim, that it is contextually credible, that there was a apocalyptic prophet, and then the various points or pieces of the gospel story that make it through the criteria that is used in the field: contextual credibility, dissimilarity, multiple attestation, and embarrassment. That one's the weakest. Seemed to me to paint a picture of an apocalyptic prophet, which kind of fit nicely. And so briefly, that would be. And then just kind of fundamentally, because I'm not a scholar, fundamentally for me as a skeptic, the fact that the vast and overwhelming majority of critical scholars is something I have to take into account, because I have to understand my own limitations, right? And so, like, if I was just going to guess at the outset who's going to be right, is it going to be me or some people who spent their entire lives researching it? I'd put my money on them, right? So.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this: do you think what percentage of Christian biblical scholars do you think are wrong about there being a real God?
The Christian ones? I think they're all incorrect because I'm an atheist.
But that's what I'm saying. I think Christian biblical scholars are as wrong about Jesus as they are about God, and for the same reason. And not to toot my own horn, but if you've read the book Jesus, Mything in Action, I talk about all the consensus and the lack of consensus in biblical studies. And again, not to dominate the conversation, not to come to
Dominate and then freeze.
We're trying to like piece together
Dragons.
the
Dragon said that Paul never said James was a brother of Jesus. He said he was a brother of the Lord. How do you feel about that?
Well, and I think that's a very important distinction to make, because Paul could have said, he's the brother of Jesus.
So sorry, I was trying to look it up, and I don't know why I can't find it. I tried various searches. A lot of people think that John is separate from the synoptics, that he wasn't aware of them. But one could argue that Lazarus is introduced in Luke, and that's where John gets Lazarus from. And of course, there are certain things such as the passion narrative and the overturning the tables in the temple that John probably got from Mark, Luke, or probably got them from Luke. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he might have been aware of Mark. But there is a thing called an intercalation, or a sandwich, and there's also the Markan sandwich. If you read the Gospel of Mark, there's always a sandwich where he will interrupt a story and place something in the middle. And you can just search this and find specific examples, but there is at least one in John that matches what Mark does. And that's why scholars think that John was aware of Mark. So although John does go off on this different thing where there are no parables and Jesus was at the beginning of time and talks in these long speeches, I don't regard John as being separate from the synoptics. I think he was aware of them, and he just didn't like he may have liked what they said, but he chose to go a different path with his story.
And like that would have made it a lot more likely that he's talking about like a blood relative. But the fact that he's using this cultic title, the Lord, or even it's even a celestial title. I don't know considering.
So I think the brother of the Lord is problematic both for historicist and mythicist, because I don't think we can positively say, just looking at that one passage, what he meant by it. And I don't think historicists can either. It's just a weird thing that he says brother of the Lord. God is also called Lord. And they might say, well, a Jew would never say that. But that's, would a Jew say that the Messiah came and didn't do anything? So, they can't make that argument when they attempt to do so. So I think it's problematic on its own. And what you have to do is really read the bulk of the Pauline letters to see that he's not talking about a person. So when he says brother, it must mean something different. And I'm going to skip past this, but they do point out that Paul does say brethren of the Lord, clearly not talking about blood relations elsewhere. He actually says brothers of the Lord. So it could be that he is distinguishing James, the brother of the Lord, meaning just a common Christian, as opposed to James, the pillar in Jerusalem.
And he mentions in their arguments, because there's just no way
David's talking.
I mean, those two disputed passages in Josephus hold up at all.
So I think it's a mistake to draw this line between
we're at
Christians
Josephus
and atheists in the scholarship, at least, because it's not the case that like you've just got Christian scholars and then atheists like me who are listening to them. There's atheist scholars, agnostic scholars, Jewish scholars, particularly at Josephus. And so if it were the case that these arguments are so ridiculous and the only reason that these scholars are making them is because they're Christian, you would think at least that the Jews wouldn't be persuaded by it, right? Or the atheists or agnostics. It seems odd to me that you don't get if it is in fact just bias.
So I mean, I think that it's poor reasoning to say, if an atheist is convinced by it, or an atheist believes it, then that means that it must be true, or that's reliable information that we get from these scholars. Keep in mind though that the group that we're talking about, the current consensus of that group is that as a historical fact, Jesus resurrected from the dead. Like that is the consensus. Thinking that Jesus did not historically resurrect from the dead as an act of God is a fringe position for that particular group. So it's really hard for me to to not distinguish between that entire group and the ones that are within the group that are I guess atheist leaning or whatnot, because even if all of the atheists that are biblical scholars or New Testament scholars or anything like that were to just suddenly flip to be a mythicist, it would still be a fringe position. It would still be looked down upon by quote unquote serious scholars. And I have trouble taking somebody seriously that calls himself a historian, but yet they were trained by a seminary. So those are the kinds of things that make me doubt it. Doubt the information that they're telling me. And I feel like I need to figure out like what is the best information, because I don't feel like I'm getting the best information from that kind of scholar.
So, well, let me just jump in and then I'll try to shut up for a little while and let everybody else talk. But I totally take.
Okay, remember he just said that. He said, "Let me jump in real quick, and I'll try to let everybody talk." Poor Dave.
Take your point, Jordan, that it shouldn't be just a Christians versus everybody else thing. And yet the preponderance of Christian influence in biblical studies, I mean, in Myth in Action, I talk about that a lot because Christian biases pervade biblical studies and always have. And it's not even a question of how many biblical scholars deny Jesus, but how many Christian scholars in the field of biblical studies, that subfield of history, are contractually required to toe the theological line, including dismissing mythicism. And that's an astounding number. And it's such a weird, bizarre situation that you don't see in any other field of history. And Philip Davies from Sheffield University, he was a historicist, and yet I agree with him so much on what he had to say about Bart Ehrman's "Did Jesus exist?" and the attitude about how this is ridiculous and shouldn't even be looked into. He says, surely the flimsy weight of Jesus should be weighed, and it wouldn't even be controversial in any other field of history to do that.
So, a couple things. I'm trying to scroll back to everything that GE said too. I don't think it's the case that all scholars that are Christian were trained in seminary, or certainly not all scholars in relevant fields. I would agree with you that if somebody is contractually obligated to hold to a statement of faith, I would look askance at their research because they can't come to any other conclusion, right? So for those scholars, I could certainly understand wanting to pass them by. And so it would be persuasive to me if I would be far more skeptical of the field as a whole if there was a stark disconnect between those kind of scholars and other scholars. And that's where I think Josephus, which I mentioned this to John, so this won't be new to him, but where I think Josephus scholars can kind of help as a compare-contrast thing, because they, by and large, are not trained in seminaries. They're mostly Jewish or secular. There are some that are Christian scholars too, but they also come to similar conclusions where their fields intersect. And you would think that if it were the case that, like the case for James' brother Jesus was so ridiculous that the only way you could get there is bias, you would think that they wouldn't get there because they have no incentive. Like, what does it matter to a Jewish scholar whether or not they think that portion of Josephus is authentic? What does it matter to them? I don't know that there'd be any pressure. And so now, just to be clear, that is not to say that they're correct, because they could all be wrong. They certainly could all be wrong. All I'm saying is that this is, to me, evidence that at least the field as a whole hasn't come to this conclusion purely through bias. And so it's still a useful heuristic to me as a layman. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And again, these aren't my closing arguments. These are my opening arguments. And we, reading the arguments against Josephus in Jesus, Myth in Action, I don't see how non-Christians are still using these arguments.
Well, can we mentioned this?
For me personally, it's like, for instance, I mean, for 300 years, Christian church fathers loved Josephus, but they complained, Origen, for instance, most famously, complained that he never mentions Jesus. Origen's copy of Josephus's work is what was passed down to Eusebius, the first guy to quote this Testimonium Flavinianum, and no one in Christianity quotes it again until Jerome. So we've got a 500-year spread where only one guy seems to know about this little commercial for Jesus that's tucked in this passage of Josephus. Well, that's the kind of thing that drives me crazy.
I wasn't talking about the Testimonium Flavianum. I was referencing later in Antiquities. For those who don't spend their free time reading Josephus, what we're talking about is Josephus was a Jewish scholar to the Romans, and he wrote a book called the Antiquities of the Jews. And in the context of writing about the Jews, a lot of people he thought were way more important than Jesus, if he mentioned it at all. He mentions Jesus arguably twice, once in the Testimonium Flavianum, which in its current state, as David said, is basically an advertisement for Jesus. And then later on, he mentions Jesus in the text we have in passing as a way of referencing Jesus' brother who was killed in a political struggle. There's a quick lesson for anybody who wasn't
following. That real fast. And just to tag onto that second story makes no sense whatsoever if it's really about anybody who is associated with the Jerusalem church, as Jacob, the brother of the Lord, was supposed to have been. But it makes perfect sense if the Jesus they're talking about is Jesus, son of Damnius, the son of the high priest, who the story actually mentions. Then it makes perfect sense.
So
I'll leave that there for now.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I don't want to.
It's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. You guys are doing great. Yeah. I did want to.
We'll both be quiet after this.
I did want to bring up a question here from Dragons, though. He mentioned the brothers again. Paul also mentioned 500 other brothers of the Lord. How many kids did Mary have?
So on that, that was something that was asked before. I think it's important to keep track of the words being used by Paul. So Paul does use the term brother all over the place. This guy's a brother, that guy's a brother, this guy's a brother, like all over the place. He clearly, the term brother was used as a fictive kinship thing for Christians, much like Christians do today, right? What is the precise title, though, brother of the Lord, is only used twice in all of Paul's writings. You've got the one in Galatians, and then you've got the one in Corinthians. So the one in Galatians is the one where he meets this person, and the one in Corinthians is the one that you mentioned earlier, David, where he's complaining about not being able to bring wives, which I don't know why he's complaining, because he didn't think you should get married anyway, but whatever. It doesn't matter. He was complaining about it.
Right. Well, they were sister wives. Yeah, basically he's talking about housekeepers. Yeah, not icky girls that you want to marry, because that's
Girls
Paul's not
worse.
into
So
that.
so anyway,
Girls
the
are
argument
worse than Paul,
goes
yes.
that this phrasing, brother of the Lord, is distinctive and separate from the other more general way of referring to brothers. And so because it's only used twice and only in context where it would make more sense to be about like distinguishing this Christian from other Christians, because if brother of the Lord simply means Christian,
wait.
then
Hold on.
Can I finish?
But when you say brethren of the Lord, but when you're saying brethren of the Lord, I mean, he's talking about a group of people.
So he's distinguishing some
it seems to be
subset.
that sect title.
He's distinguishing a subset of Christians. That set can include one or more, as all sets can include zero or more than zero members, if you prefer that terminology. So he's distinguishing a set of Christians from the larger set of Christians when he uses the term brother of the Lord. And the argument, which I personally find compelling, is that if brother of the Lord was simply a title used generically for Christians, then it wouldn't make much sense. Take the one in Galatians, because I think that's more illustrative.
Okay.
In that, it's Galatians 1:9. And he says, I'm trying to remember my Bible verse off the top of my head.
I mean, how if
Don't sweat.
while you're looking for
Well,
it,
he says,
what's the
I didn't see any apostles. I only saw James, the brother of the Lord.
Right. So
well, I'm wondering.
Talking about his trip to
I'm
Jerusalem.
wondering what the big difference is between brother of the Lord and brother in Christ. Because like the Lord in this context,
let me just. I think we could be splitting that hair forever, but what I'd like to mention is sticking with Galatians. If we just go a few verses later, when he's talking about his run-ins with the leadership of the Jerusalem church, including James, he's claiming that these guys are not real Christians. They brought in false believers. He didn't give in to them for a second. He hates those guys. He doesn't think they're real Christians, and he says, "I didn't give in to them for a minute." And when Peter came down, I opposed him to his face. It flabbergasts me that apologists can say, "Oh, look here, he's talking about the brother of the Lord," and then he treats the guys that we think of as Jesus' friends and family as their fake Christians. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
I don't know why that would be problematic. I mean, if James was Jesus' brother, that doesn't mean that Paul would be obligated to agree with him. I mean, Paul thought he got the word directly from God, right? Paul thought that God appeared to him. You know? So like, why would it matter?
But I mean, well, for one thing, if the Jerusalem church was known to be Jesus' disciples, and by the way, Paul never calls any of those guys disciples. He never even uses the word disciple for anybody in any context ever. How could he possibly defend the fact that he opposes them if they're the real deal, if they're the 12? These are the things that make me wonder. We can go all through the Gospels, and there's weird things that don't make sense according to the historicist model. And we can say, well, maybe, but I mean, it's not like this is the only one thing. And the reason I get so worked up about it is that seems to be the brother of the Lord thing in Galatians seems to be the one constant that historicists type. That's dodgy. And when you put all the other things out there, there's so many things that the reason Paul's even talking about, the reason early Christians before the Gospels are even talking about it that way, why would they say these things this way if the story is the way it's always been presented to us in Sunday school? The Christians before the Gospel's written act and talk about Jesus completely different than Christians do after the Gospels are
To be
written.
clear, I don't think it's the story. It's like we were taught in Sunday school. I am an atheist, but I just wanted to speak.
No, but I mean, I take your point. And again, like I said, there's nothing implausible about there being a guy named Jesus. But when we look at the hooks that the historical arguments are hang on, they become fewer and fewer, and all of them are a little dodgy. None of them, there's no smoking guns on the historicist side.
What about
And they act as if it's a done deal already.
What about Eusebius? Dragon says he was criticized during his life for forgeries and wrote an entire chapter defending the practice of lying for Jesus. Is this true?
Yep.
So can we trust Eusebius?
well,
This is the same guy who gave us the story of Constantine seeing the cross in the sky, and that's what converted him to Christianity. Only what?
Okay, just to point out, David did not keep quiet. And here he says, yes, Eusebius advocated lying, but then later I point that out, and David says no. So I don't know. I was trying to research it while they were talking. I'm going to have to look into it more. This may be an erroneous claim by Gibbon. So I will have to see if I can find the specific passage that I was referring to. Because what I was referring to is where supposedly Eusebius says, I have maintained everything that is for the glory of our faith, and I have suppressed that which is not, which means what isn't exactly a lie, more of like a lie of omission, that he's not going to include anything that would have made them look bad or false. But it is, I did not notice this last night because it's much later when I talk that David is like, yep, he lied. Yeah, he lied. He advocated lying. And then later, David seems to disagree with himself. But, David, I love you, man. But, maybe give other people a chance to speak.
It wasn't really a cross. It was the Cairo, which was also a pagan symbol.
I haven't
let's
heard
skip
that
forward a
particular
little.
accusation, so I can't speak to it. I don't want to speak outside of my own.
What accusation?
And I apologize because I get on a roll when we talk about these topics, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. So,
But you are.
How do you feel about that, Jordan?
But you
I'm
are.
not, I'm not going to get into whether or not Constantine was Christian because that's not the point of the conversation.
Eusebius. Was Eusebius a liar?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. I haven't heard that particular accusation, so I can't speak to it. I don't want to speak outside of my own reading.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't remember where the exact quote is, but I can possibly find it and post it in the comments after tomorrow. But Eusebius does say that it is virtuous to lie in order to promote Christianity.
To be fair, that's a chapter heading that was probably not written by him.
Oh, really? It wasn't as late as I thought. But, you just saw it. David a little while ago says, he advocated lying. And then he's like, oh, well, to be fair. So I think, I'm not sure what the difference is of David seeming to say one thing a moment ago, and now he's saying something opposite to contradict me. But I am going to look into this and see if I can find the specific quote, if it exists.
But clearly his actions speak louder than that one particular quote. People fixate on that quote, but that's not why we say he's a big liar.
The idea that Christians would write forgeries for what they saw was virtuous aims is quick.
Yeah.
Accused of being a liar.
If I can ask this because I think this plays into it, but so if whether you're a Christian or not, and you take the historical position,
Oz gets to speak.
whether we're saying it's the we'll just use the Gospels because we already talked about the Gospels. If we're saying that there is even a shred of historical reliability there, and we're going to depend on that, then that means those are the books that give us the most detail as far as the virgin birth all the way up through the resurrection, right? And if that's the case, why are we going to concede, or why are we going to walk away from the divinity? Why are we going to walk away from the miracles and only argue for, or try to the best we can cement this Jesus character? Because, like it was brought up earlier, once we parcel off, or we detach the divinity and the miracles from Jesus, we're no longer talking about the Jesus of the Bible. We're talking about a whole another person, because that is who that book claims that he was. So why argue anything different? If it's worthless, because now the crux, the linchpin of the religion, of the doctrine, of the theology falls apart as soon as you strip away the divinity and the miraculous from Jesus.
Yes, Oz is making a very prudent point. And I do this when I debate Christians on in forums. They will attempt to go, well, Bart Ehrman says that Jesus existed. He's an atheist. But no, law of identity, A equals A. The Jesus of history that Bart Ehrman advocates is not the Jesus of faith. It is not the Jesus that Christians advocate. If certain Christians, want to use Bart Ehrman, they are advocating a Jesus. They're saying, well, as long as somebody says there's some Jesus, then I'm justified. No, you're not. You're not at all. Any more than, Muslims are justified for saying, well, historians admit that Muhammad exists. And, if somebody worships Shakespeare, there are people that don't think Shakespeare existed or wrote the plays attributed to him. Well, they say Shakespeare existed. So, no, you've got to really hit Christians on this when they say that this Jesus has to be the Jesus you believe in. You can't use the historical Jesus, because that is not the Jesus you believe in. And if you do wish to use the historic Jesus, then how do you make that leap? If you're going to say, I'm going to use the rational reasoning that historians use, and then I'm going to jump to all these other things, why does your reasoning fall apart? Why does it's not consistent? If you're going to say, I'm justified for believing what I believe, you either abandon the reasoning the historians use, or you disagree with it, which would be a fringe position. I also wanted to point out, I don't know if you can see this, but Otangelo is in the thing, and of course he's bringing up the Shroud of Turin. I don't know much about the Shroud of Turin. I've never had a desire to investigate it. I do know that the Catholic priest, at least this was 20, 30 years ago, that was in charge of the Shroud of Turin when they carbon dated it to, I believe, the 14th century, maybe. The priest said he could not verify that they actually used a piece of the garment, the shroud. But, so I think it's problematical for anyone to use the Shroud of Turin as a defense. And it just shows what kind of thinking Otangelo has. And he also sounds like a Muppet.
So what why even argue?
Well, in antiquity, people did magic all the time. If you listen to people who were writing, there are certain Roman emperors, Vespasian, for example, who were said to have healed the sick and things like that. But that doesn't mean he didn't exist. So I think it would be too hasty to say this person has implausible magical things attached to them, therefore they don't exist. We strip that away and they don't exist, because it's just like how ancient people talk and thought.
But that's not what I'm saying. Is it's not the Jesus of the Bible. There may be a dude named Jesus, and there could have.
Yes, no one, and I guess Jordan misunderstood, but I know what Oz was getting at. And he's one of the few people, besides myself, that approaches it this way. It's not the Jesus of the Bible. And people aren't looking at Vespasian, not now, and saying, well, we have a minimal Vespasian, so therefore, we're justified in believing that he did all this other stuff. So I think it's erroneous for Jordan to bring that up as a counterpoint regardless, because no one is defending whatever Vespasian was said to have done. Christians are defending what it is that Jesus is said to have done.
There have been a dude walking around. It does not matter to me. That's irrelevant, because I wasn't taught for 30 plus years that there was a dude named Jesus. I was taught and indoctrinated that this dude named Jesus that is the savior of the world, Emmanuel, the second coming, the propitiation of our sin, yada yada yada. So I don't care about the dude
born of a virgin
necessarily, but it's when we strip away the divine from the dude, we're not talking about the guy in that book anymore.
Correct.
I mean, if you define, like, just, I think it's a little bit of semantics. Like, if you said, in order to be a historicist, you'd have to agree with the divine miracles thing. But I guess I'm a mythicist then, because I definitely don't agree. That's
No. Well,
No.
if I could play devil's advocate a little bit here, I don't subscribe to throwing out the Gospels as not historical sources. I think that, in my opinion, I've left myself open to the idea that there could be historical kernels in the Gospels. Where I get hung up, though, is that it's like what kind of criteria can we actually use to sift through the mythical and legendary from the historical? And I think that the quality of the Gospels are just so poor that we can't do that. Is where that's where I stand. But I guess I'm in a little bit of agreement with Jordan here, because I don't think that we should throw out the Gospels completely as if they couldn't provide us with any kind of information. I just think that the information that could be historical is so diluted to the point where we simply can't know. Like, there's no way for us to actually determine, well, is Nazareth really his birthplace, or is Matthew, writing about 10 years or so after Mark, just enlightening us as to where Mark got his information from? Because it's pretty odd explanation that doesn't require Jesus to have existed. So it seems superfluous, because that's the easiest option.
I think we're more on par there than we realize, because I'm saying, okay, if we do grant that there is some type of historical or any historical accuracy that we can take away from the Gospels, and they are accurate, is it just only 50% of it's accurate and the rest is bullshit, or is it 25% accurate and the rest is bullshit? Because it's either it's dependable or it's not, and either this guy was walking on water and spitting in mud and dirt and healing people's blind eyes, or at what point is it not reliable anymore?
No, I agree with you. Sorry, Jordan. I'll let you go here in 1 second.
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you, and what I'm saying is that we can't know. Like, unless we find new information that elucidates the filter for the Gospels, we're just simply never going to know, and that's why they're not useful as historical sources. I do see in the comments on the live stream, though, that J Mike, who's a great creator, by the way, he says multiple attestation. But the problem is that we don't have multiple attestation of this. We have one author that's being copied three times, and so that just means that we have.
Yeah,
and more. And so that just means that we have one person that's claiming either for one reason or another that Jesus is from Nazareth. Paul has no idea or care about Jesus's origin story. So it seems to me like the multiple attestation bit is really hinging on one gospel and then Paul's work. But we already know that there's strong support showing that Mark, the author of Mark, knew Paul's epistles. So really, we just have one source, and that source doesn't even mention Nazareth as a birthplace. Doesn't mention a birthplace at all. Doesn't mention, the Epiphany. It doesn't mention anything. It just mentions that Jesus is dead and he's appearing to people afterwards, and that's it.
And the two birth narratives that we do have, Matthew and Luke, which came later, they don't agree with each other at any point. None of those stories can match up, and yet somehow elementary schools do the mashup of the Christmas play, and we all see the shepherds and the wise men in the same room, but the stories, when you read them, there is no point where those things could match up at all.
I don't think we need to talk about if we're going to say Jesus didn't exist, we're not going to accept the historic Jesus either, then we need to engage what the historians are saying about the historic Jesus. We don't need to look at the birth accounts. We don't need to look at the walking on water. We need to look at what the historians say. So this was kind of, we all agree here, even Jordan, that the birth narratives are fake. We don't need to discuss such things. We don't need to discuss the resurrection. We just need to address what the historians say and where we think they're faulty in their thinking.
Basically,
Jordan, go ahead. We got one more question. Go ahead, Jordan.
Basically, the only point they agree on is that he was born in some sense in Bethlehem, because that's the point of the stories.
That brings me to the next question here from materialistic Dan.
Well, actually, no, they don't even agree that. Yeah. Never mind. Go ahead.
Under the mythicist hypothesis, how would you explain the difficulty that exists within the Gospels to make the life of Jesus fit prophecies? Would not an invented person better fit the prophecies?
Well, yeah. I mean,
well, let's see what they say.
It's interesting if you divide the prophecies into bullshit prophecies we've never been able to find the prophecies that are obviously being, having an invented person fulfill them. The whole argument from prophecy that we get from apologists just weakens itself just by pointing at them. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I agree that details of Jesus' life were almost certainly doctored by later writers who were aware of prophecies and wanted to make sure that Jesus fit them. So I don't think that the argument from the fact that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, and the only way we know about it is the writings of the guy who tells us that he fulfilled the prophecy. I think the point that
at least my and probably a lot of mythicist arguments will say that Paul and people like him, Peter, James, John, and when I use those terms, don't think Gospels, just think those names as Paul used them. Those are the three pillars, which Paul apparently uses sarcastically in his letters. What Paul says is, we got this through revelation and we got this through scripture. And when they talk about Jesus, they quote scripture, which was the Jewish texts, to back up their claims. Now, we know in our own time that we have numerologists, we have just all sorts of people that will blatantly take things out of context. And why do we look back at the gospel writers and say, well, if they were making it up, wouldn't it fit better? Well, maybe it fit fine for them. And the only time when you see in the gospels, maybe when they say, wasn't the Messiah supposed to come from Bethlehem? That is the author acknowledging that people disagree with them, but apparently the author didn't care. It wasn't a problem for the author. It wasn't a problem for Paul. It wasn't a problem for possibly John, James, and Peter, Cephas. So just because it looks problematical to us doesn't mean it was problematical to them. It's much like the criterion of embarrassment the historians use. Just because it looks embarrassing to us doesn't mean it was embarrassing to them. Was Addis getting castrated a turnoff, an embarrassment for those that worshiped Addis?
he's making is that the gospel writers seem to contort and twist to make sure that this Jesus character fits the prophecies in such a way that they wouldn't have to if they were free to just make up whatever they
want. Let's skip this.
Were true about the Messiah. And so their task is creating this narrative that fulfills these prophecies, that shows that he's,
This.
distinctly different.
I don't really
communities
want
that
to
had
go more
different
than an
ideas
hour.
about Jesus's lineage. But
You
not only
guys are
that,
still
you
watching.
had
I appreciate
two
it.
communities that both needed an earthly, like, Davidic connection, between Jesus developing. That was just part of what it meant to be a mystery cult at that time, and that's exactly what they were.
Disagree with the characterization of early Christianity as a mystery cult. So religions have rituals. I don't think
it's historically, if there's a historical Jesus, if it does not also have the divine attached to it, why is that character important?
Well, I mean, I think it's an important historical question. It sure would be nice to know. Jesus is, whether he was real or not, is one of the most influential figures of Western history. And so details about his life I find interesting just as a historical question. Does it matter to me, like, in some kind of existential way? I mean, no.
Search for truth,
If I can really quick, as far as like the early Christianity being a mystery religion and having like the secrets and everything like that, let me read.
So apostasy will be going soon. You'll notice how we're all t-shirts. Maybe Jordan looks a little decent more than us. Maybe David I think he has a button-up shirt, but Stacy's all dressed up and nice. That's because it's her anniversary and she's going to dinner.
Read from you, Mark 4, starting at verse 10. It says, when he was done, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. So, I mean, Mark is explicitly right.
Very strange.
I do have to leave because I'm going
Yes. Stacy's leaving.
from like Richard Carrier and just, like the different like mystery cults and hearing it.
Whether Jordan's side and the historicist side comes out on top, or whether the mythicist side
Yeah.
historically, and that's not even controversial. Same thing with Jesus, in my humble opinion. So you can get a lot of wiggle room, but when you take out Jesus, that's kind of it for Christianity. So I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think John, you already said it, that this is always going to be a fringe position in biblical scholarship, and priority.
So we tackle Jesus mythicism, but basically skepticism as a whole. So not just religious things, but anything where you can apply skepticism.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Logan, where can we find your stuff? Closing argument, last words?
Well, I just have a small YouTube channel called The Uncarved Block, and I've just started it, and I have a few things on there. I actually went over a interview with Derek. What's his name? You got to know him, Derek.
Lambert?
Derek Lambert. When he interviewed James McGrath, and I went through their video and made some comments, and that got my most hits, so I was so happy. I would say just very quickly that I was also a historicist. I was a theist still. I wasn't a Christian, but I went and I kept seeing Earl Darty's name pop up. And I finally went to Earl Darty's page, and I spent a year going over his entire page, trying to verify everything I could that he said. Then I read his book, and I actually had cognitive dissonance. Even though I wasn't a Christian, Jesus was still important to me. My wife was a Christian, and it upset me. This was not an easy decision for me to make. So, this isn't always just an easy blithe thing that we toss off. I would recommend Earl Darty's work. You can find Jesus Puzzle, Earl Darty. You'll find it. I think tonight his name hasn't been brought up. He's very important. He got Richard Carrier started. And I was reading today his 20 silences in the epistles, and they're just amazing to read. And I was hoping to bring one up tonight, but we didn't get to it. And so, yeah, I would more focus instead of the Gospels. When I would discuss this, I would want to focus more on the epistles and things that are in the Gospels that should be brought up in the epistles and aren't. I think that's a stronger argument than the Gospels, because if we can look at what the Gospels actually say and what they don't say, then I think we can tell what was made up in the Gospels.
Sounds like a part 2.
Yeah, let's do it.
David, where can we find your stuff? And closing.
So yeah, that was me. I would the conversation seemed to focus a lot on the Gospels. See Wes pointing me out there, so thanks, Wes. So yeah, I'm going to make a video of some probably just based on Doherty's 20 things. I'll be using him mainly as a source, and yeah, so it's amazing. There in the Epistle of James, he talks about suffering, and instead of bringing up Jesus before Pilate, Jesus suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying and blood coming from his thing, blood sweating. He talks about the Old Testament. Again, all this was from the Old Testament. This was a secret long hidden that is also in Paul's letters that was just now revealed to them without ever talking about historic man. And so I would like to just focus a discussion with Jordan and maybe the others on the epistles. So I hope we can do that.
Closing arguments, last words.
All right. Well, let's see.
My wife, Kate,
Let's see. I don't know.
I think that currently right now that probably stands as like one of the better things, although it was a little tough for me to get. Yeah, it was a little tough for me to get through the first chapter, to be honest. But
what's he talking about?
people should read it just to see what the.
Oh,
that's a top level book, so it's not.
Yeah,
it's not academic.
It's talking about Bart Ehrman's horrible
I know
book.
that probably
Did
a lot of
Jesus
people see this
exist?
in me, or that I'm an idiot. Or
Well,
something.
it's not a horrible book. It's just so. Like it came out before Carrier's work, but it came out certainly after Doherty's book and certainly after some work by Robert Price. And I just don't think he really engages the arguments. He just goes, he sits in a sandbox and he says, this is why I think Jesus exists. But okay, that doesn't address the arguments over here. Doherty has addressed the arguments that Ehrman puts forth. Ehrman doesn't counter those arguments. So it's just a poor book, in my opinion, on that side. He just plays in his own sandbox and thinks that sandbox is good and his castle won't be knocked down. Earl Doherty knocks it down, in my opinion.
Thing like that, just because I'm in the mean that I think that, it's just ridiculous to think he was a historical person, or, I'm died. They will literally, blacklist you and fire you from positions.
Yep, it will.
Stuff like that.
His Jesus apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium also gives a really good feel for where he's coming from and what arguments he uses to back him up, which I love his transparency about that. That's one thing I've always admired about him.
And for people that may not have money, a lot of time your libraries have access to Audible. So
Absolutely.
And ask your library to carry these books.
I said Audible. I meant great courses. I think that's what Jordan said. But I mean great courses.
That's another thing we can do.
That as well.
Yeah,
that as well. Thanks, guys.
Sorry, Oz. I hate to interrupt. Casey pointed out in the chat that I was asked, where can people find you? And people still don't know. So good point there, honey. I on YouTube, I'm Godless Engineer. Pretty much any social media, I'm Godless Engineer. I also have an app that I'm constantly trying to actually get updated called Crestus, and they flash the.
First of all, thank you guys for having me. I love this conversation, and I will piggyback on. As far as the actual argument, again, I think I take a little. I guess it's the same thing, but to me, it just feels more simple. It's just, what evidence do I have for Yahweh? What evidence do I have for Allah? Whatever, and I've tried to do the best I can to follow it on both sides for this Jesus character, just like I did, with the God claims, and I still find myself being empty-handed. That I don't find convincing evidence. I don't find good evidence to support that this guy was here. Who he's attributed to be in that book. But as far as where you can find me, Jen and I run the Atheist Network group, Tang Gang.
All right, so I think that's about it. It was fun. I even though I didn't say much, but it was kind of hard to get a word in, and I didn't want to be rude. And like I said, I would have liked to focus more on the epistles of Paul, but that I do know. I guess if you look at the Gospels as some source of Jesus's life, then that's why you'd want to focus on them. But if you're like me and you want to look at the earliest layer and say, what can we tell from the earliest layer? If we did not have the Gospels and we just had Paul, what would we think? And so I want to like take that and put it in a circle. And then once we address that, look at the circle of the Gospels and see where they conflict, where they line up, and things like that. So thanks for joining me. It was fun, but maybe the moderator should have jumped in more to say let's hear from Oz or Logan, and I think Godless Engineer did a good job of asserting himself. I was the new guy, so I was kind of trying to stay low key, but I thought, well, I'll just do a video after we're talking about it. But good conversation. Nice guys. Oz is, I think he's asked me to be on a show, so I hope to do that soon. And I know my schedule is not like most people's. I work 4 10-hour days, and almost 4 10-hour days, I don't really feel like doing much. And I did this after my second day, and I was beat, man. I actually called into work today because I just did not get enough sleep. So, yeah, thank you. We will, I will think about what to do. I will hopefully look into the 20 silences. Oh, look. Sorry, Otangelo. I didn't know you joined. I was just over there. Usually nobody comments on my thing. How do you explain our existence without a creator? Well, that's not the topic of this video. So, you're kind of jumping into another category, and just to address it, why when you say explain, are you saying why are humans here? Why are we here any more than squids are here? Do I have to explain squids' existence? Now, if you just want to say how we got here, well, of course, I think that abiogenesis probably occurred. And certainly after abiogenesis occurred, that's when evolution starts. And we were fortunate enough to evolve. And, my parents had sex and produced me. And I'm glad to be here. And glad to have a daughter and glad to have a wife. But I don't really seek explanation for my existence. It's just, I'm here any more than I have to explain a rock. Are you, Tangelo, going to go, oh, how do you explain that rock? So I don't know. But anyway, that's a different topic, Tangelo. I wished you would have asked something that specifically addresses the how do I do that? How do I stop sharing? Stop screen. There we go. That would have addressed the topic at hand. And I'm sorry I didn't know that you were going to be here. But yeah, because I've made 3 of these videos before and nobody's joined in. I guess as I get more subs, maybe more people will be joining in. But I do thank you for watching, Otangelo. I will end this. It's been over an hour. I had to compress the hour and 25 minutes down. So yes, thanks for joining. I will get to that top 20 silences in Paul that he had occasion to mention, even though they are occasional letters. That is often what you hear from apologists. So have a good one. Take care.